Copy of God's Word to the book of Genesis. We will be looking at the first 17 verses of Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 17. I'm going to read it, and then we will give some prolonged consideration to what Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 17 teaches us about mankind's relationship with God after the flood. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And the fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are given. Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. As with the green plant, I give all to you. However, flesh with its life, that is its blood, you shall not eat. Surely I will require your life blood. From every living thing I will require it. And from every man, from each man's brother, I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. As for you, be fruitful and multiply. Swarm on the earth and multiply in it." Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, "As for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, of all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. Indeed, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood. And there shall never again be a flood to destroy the earth." Then God said, "This is the sign of the covenant which I am giving to be between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all successive generations. I put my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. And it will be when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow will be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. So the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." And God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." Scripture reveals God's purposes and plan from the beginning as they interact or are combined with Adam and his race's sin that brings about the world as we know it. It is only because God has revealed this to us in Scripture that we are able to look at the world and we are able to understand what is our relationship and what is every other man, woman, boy, or girl, any other nation, any other state, any other society. We actually know what is the status of their relationship with God. Scripture tells us what God's character is, and when God interacts with people, we find that God always judges mankind for mankind's sin against God, but we also see that God continues to execute his purposes and plans with the world and with mankind. And when we come to Genesis 9, we are able to see that though God has destroyed the world and all flesh with the flood, there is one man and his family that have found favor and have been saved by God's provision. But because this passage of Scripture is given to us, we are able to understand the world. Now, this does not mean that anybody else understands the world in the way that we understand the world. This is not understanding through consensus. This is understanding through revelation. And here in Genesis 9, we're going to be able to learn an understanding of our relationship with God, all of your neighbors' relationship with God, North Carolina's relationship with God, the United States of America's relationship with God, and any other people, any other place, any other time, what their relationship with God is. Now, you probably have observed that since 2020, many Christians have been trying to maybe rethink their understanding of politics and government and civil authority. Some are looking to history and wondering what did previous generations of Christians conclude about the civil government. Some are anchoring their renewed understanding of civil government only in one passage in the New Testament, which clearly speaks to the issue, that is Romans 13, with Paul's instruction to those Christians who were under Caesar. Others are thinking primarily in theological terms, and one of the categories of theology that is sort of risen to the surface, and most people think this is the anchor aspect of theology that would enable us to understand government and civil authority, is eschatology. But what we learn in Genesis is that an understanding of civil government is actually rooted in creation and here in the Noahic covenant, or as God calls it here, the everlasting covenant. Some people may call it the covenant with creation. But it is important for us to learn from the book of Genesis that our understanding of government is primarily shaped by what we learn from creation and God's new creation through the flood, more than eschatology. That's not to say that eschatology or Romans 13 or church history and historical theology are not relevant to getting our feet under us as we think about government. But this passage in particular founds government for all ages and all people in the covenant that God made with all creation after the flood. So here's a principle if you are trying to get your feet underneath you to understand the government. Christian views of government are primarily based on God's creation order and the Noahic covenant. That is not something that you have as a component principle in your operating understanding of government, then you need to definitely include that now. Christian views of government are primarily based on God's creation order and the Noahic covenant. I want to summarize what these 17 verses teach us about the relationship that mankind now has with God after the flood. And you should ask two questions as we go through these. What continues in mankind's relationship with God after the flood that was present before the flood, and in particular in Eden? But you also need to ask this question: what has changed? Is anything different? After the flood, we learn, most significantly, we might add, that God can be worshiped, known, and followed. Mankind can know God, mankind can follow God, mankind can worship God, and God can receive it. It can be acceptable to God However, it always requires a sacrifice. Now, while we didn't read of that, right before chapter 9, verses 20 through 22 in Genesis 8, Noah builds an altar to Yahweh after he exits and he takes one of every clean animal and every clean bird, and he offered burnt offerings on the altar to Yahweh. In one sense, we have the first fruits of the ark are now given to Yahweh as a sacrifice and worship to God by Noah. And how does God respond? Verse 21. Yahweh smelled the smoothing aroma, and Yahweh said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And I will never again strike down every living thing as I have done. Anytime God receives something that man offers to him, that God accepts that God is pleased with that. That's what this metaphor of a soothing aroma is, from the smoke of the offering that's lifted upward from the altar. Anytime God accepts this, there is peace between God and man. There is not enmity, there is not division, there is not separation. There actually has been a reconciled relationship, so that God actually receives from the creature that bears his image the worship that the creature is giving to him. And from that, we are able to learn, after the flood, man can still commune with God. Man can still worship God. Man can still know and follow God. This indeed is not because of man, but because of God. God is merciful. And what we will see as we continue through the book of Genesis and through the first 5 books of the Old Testament is God indeed will show himself to be just, but he will accent his mercy more. Here we see God's mercy receiving worship from Noah, but it does require a sacrifice. Blood must be shed. When we live in a day and age when it seems that Christians don't even understand the Christian faith, that Protestant congregations that you can attend to, and you would just judge them on the basis of what do they say and what do they do. It seems as if they do not understand that the nature of God is that in order for God to receive not only the individual, but anything the individual would ever offer to God, and for God to be pleased with it, a life must shed its blood. Atonement for sin must be given. This is now the new requirement that will always mark for every people, in every place, in all times. If there is not a sin atoning sacrifice according to God's demands, then God will not have any relationship with that man, with that woman, with that people. Do you believe this? Do you believe that a relationship with God is just something that someone could have because they just want it? Do you think someone can just sort of sober up and come to the reality that your life is a disaster and that you've ruined it because of your sin, and you really do not like the consequences that you now see all around you? Indeed, you've ruined family relationships, friend relationships, financial situations, and maybe God can help. Indeed, he can help. But God does not establish that you get to determine how it is that you will relate to him and how he will relate to you. God determines how that will happen. And the sacrifice must be given. This particular component, which is, in one sense, the first part of the covenant that we see established here, that does not end with Noah and his sons, but continues with all people to this very day. A sacrifice is what started. And with every other covenant, we will see God make a sacrifice will be given. Sinner, if you want to be reconciled to God, you need a sacrifice. You need blood to be shed on your behalf so that God may receive you. And what did we start out worship this morning with? That God indeed has provided that sacrifice for us, hasn't he? That our redemption, the forgiveness of our sins, has been accomplished by God in his Son. Sinner, you can have fellowship with God. You can walk with God. You can know God. You can serve God. You can worship God. But you must come to him through another covenant, which is the new covenant, and through the sacrifice, which is his Son. But here in the Noahic covenant, we see that God can be known, God can be followed, God can be worshiped. God has not decided to end the relationship that he will have with mankind after the flood. Number two, God graciously blesses mankind in the same way he blessed Adam and Eve in Eden. In verse 1 of chapter 9, and then again in verse 7 of chapter 9, we hear God say to Noah and to his sons exactly what God said to Adam and to his wife: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And again in verse 7, as for you, be fruitful and multiply, swarm on the earth and multiply in it. Now, this you may recall from Genesis chapter 1. It is a blessing that when God blessed the creatures of the earth and he commanded them to multiply themselves, that was God's blessing of life to them. And when God blessed his image bearers, the blessing was that they would go and bring forth life. This is one of the ways in which the Noahic covenant, this covenant here, this everlasting covenant, requires for people in every age and every place to this day and forever. We have an obligation in relationship with our Creator to bring forth life. And the way that life ordained by God is to be brought into the world is that a man takes a woman and they marry and they make babies. Zach, in that way, you have illustrated for us that you are pursuing indeed what is required of all people everywhere is that men need to find a wife, take them, and then they fill the earth with their children. But you need to understand this is not a cultural value. This is a theological condition that is a part of the Noahic covenant. This is not for so-called Christian nations to understand as their mission. This is every nation to understand that God requires of man that you be fruitful and you multiply. That is how every man can actually know God's blessing. This is not a salvific or a saving blessing of God only to those whom he redeems. This is an aspect of God's common grace that he blesses those whom he has not redeemed. But one of the ways that is very clear in this covenant relationship that all people in all times can know God's blessing is that they multiply and bring forth life. This is why, even as evil as we are, as Yahweh himself said, that the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And yet amongst evil men and women, what are we able to see that tends to be still a natural high water mark of blessing in life? Children. You want to talk about the sickest of human beings on the face of the earth, look for those human beings who do not delight in children. here we are able to see God graciously blesses mankind, repeating what he said in Genesis 1:28 to Adam, and here he says it to Noah and to his sons, that they are to have children. One of the questions could be after the flood, is God going to continue the plan that he put in place with Adam in the garden? Or is God going to be done with that? Here we see God continues that indeed people are going to fill the earth, and God's image is going to be made known in all creation, for God determines that Noah and all those after him, not only his sons, but every living creature, all flesh, which if you're wondering, you can look around and you can make observations like this, like who has more melanin? Whose hair color is this? Whose hair color is that? What is like, you can just, do all the different distinctions that we can look around the room and separate ourselves. But guess what? All of us come from Noah and his sons. The genetic diversity in the Adamic race, with all of our different colors and unique features, is incredibly insignificant. It would shock you. And yet we can look so different, and yet we are not different at all. God has determined after the flood that the relationship he will have with man is that man will experience his blessing, and they will be fruitful, and they, with their families, they will fill the earth, so that through families having children, God's glory will spread over the earth again. It will be Noah and his sons and their grandsons and granddaughters and great-granddaughters and great-grandsons. We will be able to see that though man's evil brought God's judgment in the flood, man's evil did not change God's plan. His image will be born throughout the earth in children being born to families over and over again. God decreed that the earth is going to be full of his families because he has saved this family, Noah and his sons, to start and continue what God began with Adam in the garden. Now, who seems merciful when we consider that? The same God who brought the flood. Indeed, God is just, and God's wrath is against sin, but God is also merciful. And God in his mercy continues what he has already decreed to accomplish. And here we are able to see that this particular covenant obligates people, not some people some of the time, but all people all the time, to have an ageless commitment to be pro-life, pro-family, and pro-children. And the reason that this is an obligation is because God has commanded it. When you look at verse 1 and verse 7 in Genesis 9, we are able to see that these are imperatives. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. As for you, be fruitful and multiply. Now, I am glad that I am preaching to the choir. I am happy that our problems in church are things like nurseries, children running through the building when children, you do not run in the building. Leave the building if you want to run. I'm glad our challenges in this church are, parents, you need to learn not only to make babies, but then you have to raise your babies. You need to teach them. You need to discipline. You need to instruct them. The baby making is relatively the easy part. You actually now have to do the parenting part. That is all a part of the same game. I'm glad those are our problems, but we do not live in a world where this is the way our world thinks. This is not the values of our society. And we therefore have to conclude, because God obligates our society to what he commands here in the Noahic covenant, that if our society, or you as a constituent part of our society, if you are not committed to pro-life, pro-family, and pro-children, then you actually are rebelling against God. We can say this in certain ways that especially is offensive to some individuals. If you are young and not married, then what you need to do is you need to realize, provided that in God's providence He provides for you a Christian spouse, you marry. And when you marry, you have children. And when you have children, you will devote the lion's share of your life to raising those children, and then you will die. Now, Satan and his pawns have effectively schemed that there is a better version of life. And I just want you to understand, from Genesis 9, you have the necessary discernment to realize that if someone else spins to you another version of life, it did not come from God's lips, but rather it is that split-tongued serpent who is offering you another understanding of life. Say it another way. If you are single and you do not have categorically my hope in obedience to God is to be married. And then if you marry, if you categorically do not understand to be married is to pursue having children, you are rebelling against God. You have a disposition of rejection of what God stipulates in the Noahic covenant. Now, there's a whole bunch of questions that are necessary to parse out on a case-by-case basis. I understand there are genetic diseases that are passed down through children. There are financial considerations that individuals need to make. There are questions of how many. I mean, there's many practical questions that married people will need to consider. But none of those considerations change the clear obligation in the Noahic covenant that God has now for all of those who come from Noah, which is everyone. Now, we cannot look to our society and see this reflected. But we should be able to look to the church and see the clearest example of how this gracious commandment and blessing of God is actually a life of dependence upon God, that God may give to us children. God may give to us life from life. Consider the opposite. If nothing comes from life, are you seeing God's blessing there? No. If death comes from life, you're seeing God's curse there. But if life comes from life, when the promise is, if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of fruit and evil, what will happen? You will surely die. And if here in this blessing in the Noahic covenant, God extends to all people who come from Noah, life will come from you. That's God's blessing. Nowhere should that be more potent. Nowhere should that be more thickly applied than to the church of Jesus Christ. So, practically speaking, the Noahic covenant commands all people everywhere, but especially joyfully embraced by Christ's church, that we make babies, we train our babies to become God-fearers and do His will in this world. That's an obligation of this covenant relationship that God makes with mankind after the flood. Another summary point before we land on some conclusions about government is here we learn that God graciously covenants with Noah, his descendants, all flesh, and creation. This is the first time that Scripture explicitly states that this relationship is a covenant. And here we are able to see that it is God who makes this covenant with Noah, but not only Noah. It is with Noah and his sons, but it is not only with Noah and his sons. It is with Noah and his sons and all that will come from them. A few places that you can see that this is clearly extended beyond Noah and his sons is if you start in verse 9. As for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is, I didn't tell you, yeah, verse 9, now in verse 10, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, of all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. Indeed, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood, and there shall never again be a flood to destroy the earth. This covenant is a formal relationship that does have agreements, and there's different types of covenants in Scripture. Here, this covenant is unilateral because God says it is my covenant. He is the one that makes it, and we do not see Noah or his sons responding like we see later at Sinai, Israel responding by accepting and formally agreeing to the terms of the Mosaic covenant. However, in this covenant that God makes, we see that he gives commands or instructions to mankind and all creation. Thus, that this covenant, while only made by God and has requirements that God must keep, it does require that man must do what God wills. God's part of the covenant, he promises that he will never destroy flesh or earth with the flood. The sign of the covenant that God gives, it's actually rendered to us in such a way that for us, as we read about the rainbow, the bow in the clouds, it's for God to look and remember the covenant he made. Indicating, why would God have to look at the sign of the covenant and remember, I cannot destroy all flesh? Because this is a little bit of God revealing to us, I will have many occasions where it would clearly be right to destroy all flesh. See, this is a gracious and merciful covenant that God makes with mankind and all creation. And in that sense, the sign is not because God needs help to remember, but rather it is for us to understand as we look at the sign that God himself has committed himself to creation, that he will not destroy flesh with a flood. Another observation we make from this is that God graciously arranges in this covenant with post-flood humanity. He graciously arranges it for a post-fall world. And this is where we see some differences beginning. God permits new food sources for man. Yeah, after the flood, God now says, you can eat meat. I understand, like you should be probably going, hallelujah. It's very clear that God explains something in verse 3. Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. You just should read it. Some of y'all need to read it real hard. Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. That's why hippy-dippy food laws are not a part of the Christian worldview. If you think that you can say, you shall not eat this, you have violated what God has stipulated. Now, you yourself have the sovereignty to decide what goes down your gullet. And for some people, this side of the curse, there are unfortunate diseases that do not allow people to eat all the good things that they could. And it is indeed unfortunate, is it? And I do not mean this in jest. I mean this in all seriously. It is a consequence of the fall that everyone cannot eat everything that God graciously gives to us. But you cannot ever make a law about it. Here we are able to see that after the flood, God makes a provision for a post-fall world, and that is meat now will be a food source. Not only meat, so for some of you and me, you may have to also remember, as with the green plant, I give all to you. There is a new provision for man in the Noahic covenant after the flood that takes into consideration the post-fall world. But there is a requirement on this new form of food for man. And verse 4 tells us that flesh with its life, that is its blood, you shall not eat. Now, if you want to have a rendering of this, you can go many places and watch wild animals chase down other wild animals, and then with blood, flowing fresh from their veins, watch how they eat. We are not, and by we I don't mean Christians. I mean those creatures that bear God's image, man and woman, boy and girl. You're not allowed to eat that way. There is ordained here, in one sense, we might call it a ceremony. That when an animal is killed, we are required to drain the blood from that animal, to process it in such a way that a distinction is made regarding the blood of that animal. That animal had life in it. And we killed that animal so that we may eat it. And God has provided it for us, but we must still honor life. And so blood will be drained from the animal before we eat. If you do not have this kind of God-centered understanding of food being provided for you in a post-flood life in relationship with God, then you are living in violation of God. You are living in rebellion against God. You can't treat meat as if it didn't come from an animal that God gave life to. So this is required of us. We don't act like animals. We don't slaughter animals and there with their blood running fresh, we don't begin to devour them. We're made in God's image, and we will honor the fact that God gives life to animals, and when we do take it, we will have that ceremony. And we will let the life come out of the animal. And then we will eat. Another reason for this particular stipulation on this new provision of food for man after the flood is sacrifices are now going to be required for man to continue in relationship with God. And those sacrifices will include the blood of the sacrificial animal being symbolically thrown on the representative place of the person, so that when one sees blood flow from an animal sacrificed for one's sin and then tossed on the altar, you understand, what does blood from a sacrifice do? It atones for sin. See, blood is sacred not only because we are taught that life is in the blood. Life is sacred because atonement requires a life to be sacrificed. This is why we have this new requirement on this new food that has not been addressed before, because it was not a food before. Now, this creates a number of problems, does it not? What do you think animals will come to learn about us as we go tromping around in the woods? They'll begin to realize that we have some interest in them that they might not really appreciate. And some of those animals are able to fight back. And if an animal does take a man's life, we're going to see as we move to the next observation that whether it's an animal or a man, if you take a man's life, then your life will be taken. Verse 5 renders this way. Surely I will require your lifeblood from every living thing. I will require it. That indicates that if it was possible, find great white sharks, for whatever reason that they choose to eat human beings, that there would be basis on the Noahic covenant to say, this is the shark that ate this person, therefore this shark must die. But it does not in any way find itself as being primarily a requirement for such animals, but rather for man. Verse 5 continues, and from every man, from each man's brother, I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. See, God now in this covenant graciously orders civil government for the protection of human life that requires capital punishment for murder. The Noahic covenant stipulates for all people in all times that God orders civil government for the protection of human life by requiring capital punishment for murder. This is rhetorically emphatic. You can see that Moses is repetitive in making this point. It is stated in one sense in a propositional way in verse 5, but then poetically it is restated in verse 6. And in one sense, the kind of accent point in verse 6 is the basis for why this is required of every man, of every society, in every age. And that is because every human being is God's image bearer. For in the image of God, he made man. God prohibits murder because mankind bears God's image in the world. This is the foundational basis for all human ethics. Anytime anyone, anywhere treats a human being in a way that does not honor God's image in that human being, they are sinning against God. They are breaking this covenant relationship that God has established. Murder is when one actually takes the life of God's image bearer. Nothing in creation is more important to God than God. And nothing in creation bears God's image in the world more than man. And therefore, when someone kills another man, another woman, a boy or a girl, God is angry. And God makes it very clear. He now establishes for human society, for civilizations of human beings, that not only from Noah and his family, but from the civilizations that will come from him, they are to understand they have a responsibility before God in this covenant relationship, that they must order themselves in such a way that a government is required to protect life by capitally punishing those who kill life. See, God alone is the only one who lawfully and righteously not only gives life, but takes life. And it is always unlawful for any man to murder another man. And so God designs government to be able to protect life through the punishment of those who murder another human being. In order for life to be protected, dignity has to be given to all men and women, all boys and girls, all of the time, because they do bear God's image. And therefore, they are to treat others according to the image of God in them. It's not a cultural feature, it is a creation order feature. The countless transgressions that have been made against God's image in sins against mankind are counted by God. And while we will never be able to execute perfect justice in the protection of life through the punishment of all those who murder, God can and will. But there is a temporal order on earth for this creation order of justice to be done by mankind, and it requires that we understand something about the necessary vehicles to simply to execute with capital punishment those who have murdered another human being. One thing we are able to observe here is that government is required to do these. There are three components. You may not have noticed them, but if you think about them, I think they are obvious. There are three components in God's command for capital punishment for those who take another person's life. First, societies must determine guilt of murder. In our government, as a constitutional republic, we have a whole branch of our government that has this obligation. The judicial branch must function in such a way that it's able to determine this person is guilty of this capital crime. God will go on in Israel in the Mosaic covenant to make explicit that there are requirements of justice that God has. That is, that there must be 2 or 3 witnesses that is able to establish the guilt of the one accused. This is a wise, I think, and timeless requirement that would serve all nations and civilizations well. But here we are clearly able to see that this is a function not of a vigilante system of justice, but rather of a society's ordered of due process that we call a government. Civilizations will need wise judges and fair courts that will be, in one sense, designed and equipped to do this very thing that God commands. The judicial branch or function of a government must determine, is this person guilty of a capital crime? The second requirement in order to do what God commands in verse 5 and 6 of Genesis 9 is that societies, civilizations, governments, nations, states, counties, they have to promote the law. The law is that you shall not kill. You shall not, the kill is not the right word. You shall not murder man. That is the law. Here it's stated that whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. And in that sense, there is a clear declaration of what God requires of man. That is law. And every civilization is therefore given the responsibility to figure out a legislative function of its governing authorities. Now, there's a bunch of different types of governments that have been done at different ages after Noah. Clans or tribes have had their ways of doing governing. Monarchies are a most popular way that governance has been implemented. We have a constitutional republic, so we have our own particular way of doing this. But whatever the form of government is, societies now have to not only determine actual guilt of capital crimes, but they also have the duty of promoting the law through successive generations. The third requirement is you now must execute the punishment. It is not enough to have laws on the books. It is not enough to tell successive generations or people who come into your land and to your people, this is what our law is. If you do this, then your life will be taken from you. That is not obedience to what God requires of man here. What God requires of man is that you actually execute the punishment. Therefore, we are able to say a few things as it pertains to government. Government is not an idea. Government is an actual civil authority, many different ways it's constructed, but it's a civil authority that rules over the people under it with a literal power to execute its citizens who break its law. When you do not have that, you now have a failed government. And far more than just a failed government, you have a group of people who are not living according to the covenant that God made with them and all creation in the Noahic covenant. Those who commit murder have an obligation for their life to be executed by their societies. And God is the one who has given this obligation. For those societies who fail to execute capital punishment for those who are guilty of capital crimes, then what they are rebellious societies, rebellious civilizations, rebellious states against the Creator, who indeed brought the flood and wiped flesh from the face of the earth. But many people think that they actually are trying to promote human life. They're trying to, in one sense, make humans flourish on the earth by neglecting what God commands here. There are many people who advocate that you should not practice capital punishment for capital crimes for the sake of humanity, when in fact they're achieving exactly the opposite. For societies like our own, who is so hesitant to actually do what God commands of us, to execute those who do these capital crimes, you are actually encouraging capital offenses. Now, this is probably a more likely illustration that we all would be able to understand. Children, you need to look at me. If your daddy tells you, do not do that, and you do that, and your daddy does not give you any consequences for your disobedience, and he does not do this one time or some of the time, but your daddy all the time, he doesn't give you consequences for your disobedience, what do you learn? You learn that you can disobey daddy and not suffer consequences. You can learn that you can break daddy's laws, you can live in disobedience to daddy's commandments, and you will not suffer. And so your daddy, because of his failure to do his duty, has now, in one sense, encouraged you to not do your duty. See, families and societies operate on the same creation order principles. And here in the Noahic covenant, this is explicit. For those societies, civilizations, states, nations that refuse to actually execute those who commit capital offenses, what they are doing is they are promoting others to commit capital crimes. So I want to make a few conclusions about government and the Noahic covenant. The Noahic covenant advances God's gracious plan for redemption in this world while providing an instrument to curb sin through government. The Noahic covenant commands governments to protect life by executing murderers. This is God's gracious covenant provision for life after the flood and life after the fall. For democratic republics like ours and our 50 states, citizens therefore have to blame themselves for violations of their state and their nation's refusal to obey God's commands of this covenant. So we can throw dirt and mud at our state and our nation for its disobedience, but we are a constitutional republic. And so it is the citizens of the state of North Carolina and of the United States of America that ultimately are held responsible before God for what actually is not done in our nation. Therefore, God's judgment is being revealed from heaven against the ungodliness and the unrighteousness of man in our nation. And we should not be surprised. The only thing that really should surprise us is how patient he has been. We should understand that indeed God will judge and God should judge, and he will do so by our actions. But even though governments like our own have failed to do what God commands them to do, the Noahic covenant also teaches us that governments are good. Governments are something that God has created, and its first institution is here in the Noahic covenant. Governments exist to protect life. Governments exist, Paul will go on to say in Romans 13, for the protection of the innocent. Governments exist to punish the guilty. This is a good sword that God has given to governments that would, for those who obey God's law and love their neighbor, the government would be no threat to them. See, God's provision of government is something that we should give him praise and thank for and understand. But the government has a limited application in God's plan. The government is given a sword. The government is required to establish law and to execute punishment for those who disobey it. The government cannot change hearts. And as we saw with Cain, and Jesus came and taught, murderers are only doing what they've already done in their hearts. And the reason that we desperately need governments who have real swords is because all citizens have sinful hearts. That is what God himself said in verse 21 of chapter 8. The intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And one of God's common graces here in the Noahic covenant is government to deal with citizens who have evil intent in their heart, which if government does not do what it should do, they will act upon that evil intent. God's purpose for the government is to give evildoers pause before they execute outside with their bodies what they've already internally consummated by the sin of anger and envy. Because they should ask this question: do I really want to die to consummate the sin that is in my heart? We also learn from the Noahic covenant, as it pertains to governments and what governments must do, is that human rights are not given to citizens by governments. Human rights are given to citizens of governments by God. God is the one who says that capital punishment must be applied to those who commit capital crimes because God's image is in man. God is the one who determines human rights. This is critical because when societies become secular like ours or under some kind of other false religion, then they're going to try to create some other foundation and reject the foundation that it's God determines what human rights are. And that clearly has been the play that has been run upon us in this country. So you have things like what we have. What happens when the relationship with God and man after the flood, which is indeed formally made a covenant? What happens when you reject it? Well, you can call murdering a child in your womb abortion and then allow murderers not to be punished with capital offenses. Now, I say that not ignorant of the fact that we have murderers in this room. But if any of us has committed with our bodies what all of us have committed in our hearts in the sin of anger, but we would rightly be able to say, no, what I actually deserve, not only before God, but also with others, is I deserve to die because I've taken a man's life. The baby that was in my womb. That actually should be the way in which we understand abortion. And thus, we would have in our governments these kinds of statements. If you do take that child that is in your womb, you have murdered, and your life will have to be taken from you. There is another way. What happens when you disregard the relationship that God has between man and God after the flood in this formal covenant is no longer is suicide considered self-murder. I also know that there are people in this room who have had people that they love to take their lives. But it is self-murder. I want everyone who hears my voice, you need to hear me. If you ever think about taking your own life, you need to understand this is what you are thinking about doing. You are thinking about breaking God's law. You are thinking about murder. And you will not get to the other side of death. And you will not stand before God, and you will not find it to be the solution that the devil's lies and your sinful heart is telling you it is a solution to. It is not a solution. You will stand before God as one who is guilty of murder. And societies who reject this covenant, they reject suicide to be what it actually is, self-murder. Societies who reject this covenant, like Canada seems to be racing as fast as they can to figure out ways to rebel against God, they now actually call assisted suicide some kind of health care. And then every individual, Canada right now is even imagining that children, minors, would be able to choose assisted suicide without their parents' approval. And I hope that that makes us nauseous, but guess what? That doesn't make many of our fellow Americans nauseous. When one rejects this, what you need to understand that if government is not functioning as God says government should function, then there will only be new and inventive ways for murder to be done. See, to understand what the Noahic covenant gives to us, indeed points us forward to what God is going to bring from one of Noah's sons, that seed from the woman who will crush the serpent's head. But it is necessary that we also understand here, God has a plan for us to put in place that is absolutely crucial for society right now. And we are not without discernment. God has given us the ability to understand what should government do. Here in Genesis 9, we are able to see the innocent should be protected and the guilty should be punished. Well, if you have questions about what I've said, come and talk to me afterwards, or we could schedule a meeting